Here with Eyal, the author of Hooked and Indistractable. Welcome, Sir Nir.
Thank you. Oh, I just got knighted. Certainly. That's great. I
Yes.
appreciate that.
I believe that everybody should have like really high self-esteem, so I do my best to help out. So, your latest book, your first book was Hooked, which talked about how to make products and services and things like engaging and how to hold people's attention. And that's, that's from the perspective of somebody creating something that's engaging. And of course, one of the problems that we have in the world and that has developed is that some people have made things a little bit too engaging. And those of us on the receiving end of engaging would really like to have a little more control over what it is that we're engaging with. And so your second book is Indistractable, which seems to me to in essence be the mirror image of the first book in the sense that the first book is from the provider point of view. Indistractable is kind of completing the circle from the consumer point of view. What sparked your interest in doing this issue in these ways?
Yeah, so Hooked is really about how to build good habits, how to build healthy habits through the products and services we use. And that's what I do. I help companies build healthy habits with their products. So I work with companies in healthcare, I work with companies in financial services and education to get people hooked to healthy behaviors. What I wanted to do was also to look at the other side, right? If Hooked was about how do we build good habits, Indistractable is about how do we break bad habits. And I write my books, frankly, for me. I write books that when I look for a question that I have in my own life, and I read other people's books and they don't answer the question appropriately, that's when I say, okay, well, I got to dig into this myself and go back to the primary research and start figuring out how to solve this problem for myself. So that's what happened with Hooked. I didn't find a book on how to build habit forming products. So I wrote it. And with Indistractable, I didn't find ways to help me manage distraction that didn't involve these, very superficial solutions like, oh, throw away your cell phone, stop using social media. Well, that wasn't practical and wasn't
Right.
effective for me. And so I really was looking for a solution that dug deeper than just the proximal causes, just whatever distraction we might be holding in our hands, and actually look at the deep psychological reasons that we get distracted.
Well, which is a perfect setup for the next question that I wanted to ask you, because I've read a lot. I used to have a podcast that was on personal productivity, which is how we met. And one of the things that kind of came up over and over and over and over was distractions. And my solutions were all of the superficial sort that you were just talking about. It's, oh, well, turn off your cell phone or whatever. Even as I realized that in many cases, it just isn't practical to so the standard solutions just don't work. Or you can't do it
They don't
because your
work.
boss wants you on Slack or whatever. However, you
Exactly.
had a great analysis of the root of distraction in your current book, and I would love it if you would tell us about that because it was a framing I had
Sure.
never heard, and it left me going like, wow.
Yeah. So the first place to start is what is distraction really, right? We tend to think that distraction emanates from our phones or from the latest technology, but of course, distraction is something that people have struggled with for at least the past 2,500 years. That's when Plato, the Greek philosopher, talked about distraction, and he talked about it in the context of akrasia, the tendency to do things against our better interests. So if people were complaining about distraction 2,500 years ago, this can't be a new problem. This has to be something that's deeper than just our latest technologies. So the best place to understand what distraction is to understand what distraction is not. So if you ask most people what is the opposite of distraction, they'll tell you it's focus, right? I don't want to be distracted. I want to be focused. But that's not exactly right. If you look at the origin of the word distraction, the opposite is not focus. The source of the word, the origin of the word, is the Latin root trahare, which means to pull. So the opposite of distraction is not focus. The opposite of distraction is traction. Both traction and distraction come from the same Latin root, trahare, which means to pull, and they both end in the same six letters, A-C-T-I-O-N, that spells action. So traction is any action that pulls you towards what you said you were going to do, things that you do with intent, things that help move you closer to your values and help you become the kind of person you want to become. Those are acts of traction. The opposite of traction is distraction. Distraction is any action that pulls you further away from what you plan to do, further away from your values, further away from becoming the kind of person you want to become. So this isn't just semantics. This is actually really important because I would argue that any action can be traction or distraction based on one word, and that one word is forethought. That there's nothing wrong with checking social media or watching YouTube videos or playing video games or whatever it is you want to do with your time. That's fine as long as it's done with intent, as long as you use forethought to plan out your time and your schedule based on your values, not someone else's. So anything can be an act of traction. Conversely, I would argue that anything can be distraction. So many people, they think, oh, well, if I'm checking email, that's a work-related task. I'm being productive, right? Well, if you plan to do something else, if you plan to work on that big project or make those sales calls or do whatever it is that you said you were going to do, but now you're doing something else, checking email, doing the latest easy thing on your to-do list to check it off your list, that it can be a distraction. And that's actually the most dangerous form of distraction, because that's a case where distraction is tricking you into prioritizing the urgent work and the easy work at the expense of the hard and important work we have to do to move our lives and careers forward. So just because it's a work-related task doesn't mean it's not a distraction. That's in fact the worst kind of distraction, because you don't even realize you got distracted. So we have traction, we have distraction. Now we have what we call the triggers. There are, of course, the external triggers. These are all the pings, the dings, the rings, the usual suspects that we blame, the things outside of us that can lead us towards distraction. But studies find that's only 10% of the reason we get distracted. Only 10% of the time that we go off track is because something happening outside of us. What's the other 90%? The other 90% of the time we get distracted, it's because of what we call an internal trigger. What's an internal trigger? An internal trigger is an uncomfortable emotional state that we seek to escape from. Boredom, loneliness, stress, anxiety, fatigue, loneliness, these uncomfortable emotional sensations that we feel that we seek to escape from. And what low performers do is that they try and escape that discomfort with distraction, right? They take a shot of a drink, they watch TV, they scroll social media, they check email, they do whatever they can to get out of that uncomfortable emotional state. Whereas high performers, they lean into that discomfort. They use it as rocket fuel to propel them towards traction rather than doing what most people do, which is allow themselves to try and escape it with distraction. So now we have this model. This is the Indistractable model. We have traction, distraction, internal triggers, and external triggers. And now what we do is we use these 4 steps like a compass to help us become indistractable. By number 1, first step, master those internal triggers. If we don't master those uncomfortable emotional states, they become our masters. Step number 2 is making time for traction. If you don't plan your day, somebody's going to plan it for you. You have got to decide for yourself how you're going to spend your time. Step number 3 is hacking back those external triggers, all those pings, ding, and rings. We can do something about those external triggers, even though it's only 10% of the reason to get distracted. Very easy steps that we can all take to put them in their place. And then finally, the last step is to prevent distraction with pacts, which is where we erect a firewall, a last line of defense to prevent us from getting distracted by deciding in advance what we will do in response. So it's really about those 4 steps in concert. This is how we become indistractable.
All right. Now, the reason that we're doing a live stream here is because I love to use this as an opportunity to get free coaching from people who would normally charge me $10,000 an hour for it. So let's say that you hypothetically had a person who was hypothetically fairly scheduled and routinely has a number of appointments in their day, but with like maybe half an hour in between appointments here and there. And that person might be thinking, oh, right, like I'm going to drop the third person. So I might look at my schedule and I might think, oh, look, I actually have 4 hours of free time tomorrow. It's just scattered between these different appointments. So I'm going to use that 4 hours to actually finish this thought task that I've been working on. And what happens is I have a meeting, the meeting ends, I get up, I go to the bathroom, I come back, and then somehow I end up doing something else. And then I have another meeting, and the same thing happens like 6 times. And then at the end of the day, I look back and I go, I never, I had 4 free hours, scattered, but 4 free hours, and I didn't get anything done except the meetings. Help me, Nir. What's going on?
Yeah,
'Cause-
yeah.
yes.
So there's a lot going on there, So it's about using these 4 steps in concert. The first step is to understand, what are you escaping from, right? So when you say you're going to do one thing, what drives you to do something else? By the way, this is Plato's 2,500-year-old question. When he asked, Why is it that despite us knowing what to do, what is this tendency towards what in the Greek akrasia, to do things against our better interest? If we know what to do, why don't we just do it? And the answer, what he didn't realize, is that all human motivation comes from a desire to escape discomfort, which is kind of which is very different from how most people perceive motivation. Most people think motivation is about carrots and sticks, right? It's about the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. But neuroscience today is true that what we now know that Plato never did is that everything we do is about the desire to escape discomfort. Everything, even the pursuit of pleasurable sensations, is psychologically destabilizing. Lusting, craving, wanting, desire, these things are uncomfortable, which is how the brain gets us to do things. So the first question is, if I say I'm going to do one thing and I don't do it, why? And the reason is always the same. I didn't feel like it.
Yes,
I
that's right.
didn't feel like
I just had a meeting.
it.
I'm like, my brain is full of the meeting. I
Yeah,
I'm
I
getting
need a break.
petulant.
I deserve.
Yeah.
I need to go get a snack, or let me just get a cup of coffee, or let me just do the laundry. Let me just take out the trash. It's a million different things. And of course, today, if you're looking for distraction, boy, we carry it around with us all the time if that's what you're looking for. But the root cause, it's up here, right? It's that we are looking for an escape from an uncomfortable sensation. And people, this, I just saw that, that reaction you had. It's so much easier to say, no, it's your fault, phone. You did it to me. But of course, that's not the real reason. The real reason is that there's some kind of internal trigger, some kind of discomfort that we seek to escape. And we use these distractions to take our mind off of that discomfort. So the first step has to be having a set of tools, arrows in your quiver that you can take out so that when you feel stressed, anxious, lonely, bored, uncomfortable, whatever the case might be, you know what to do with that discomfort. So that's step number one. Step number two is planning out that time. So it's not, when oftentimes when I work with people and they tell me how distracted they are and they had a list of a million things they had to do and yet they didn't get them done. Why didn't I get them done? I say, let me see your
To-do
schedule.
list. To-do
And
list.
by and large, to-do list. Okay, so to-do lists
To-do
are one of
list.
the worst things. I hate to tell you this, Steve, but it's one of the worst things you can do for your personal productivity. Because if you only keep those items on a to-do list, there's no constraint, right? You can always add more stuff to a to-do list, which is why the critical step is to move those to-dos onto a schedule and track yourself and measure yourself not by how much you finished. Okay, this is super important. Don't measure yourself by how many cute little boxes you checked off. Why? Because that's going to lead you to do the easy. When people reward themselves based on, oh, look how much I got done, look how fun it is to check off little boxes, they do the easy stuff, right? Because it feels like progress.
Right, you can
Stop
check
that.
off boxes.
Instead, exactly. Instead, what we want to do is to measure ourselves based on on one metric, and that metric is, did I do what I said I was going to do for as long as I said I would without distraction? That's it. Not did I finish. Okay, big distinction. Did I do what I said I was going to do for as long as I said I would without distraction? And even if that's 30 minutes, right? I set 30 minutes on my calendar and that's all I'm going to do. I'm just going to work on this one thing for 30 minutes without distraction. The people who use that technique actually finish more. They actually do get more done than the people who use the to-do list technique, because that's the critical trait. It's not the people who work on a task 5 minutes here, 5 minutes there, 5 minutes there. It's the people who can devote 30 minutes to just working on that one task. They actually finish more. So they do that by scheduling the time, by using this time boxing technique and holding themselves accountable to say, hey, if I said I'm going to do it, that's what I'm going to do for just 30 minutes, 45 minutes, however much time they say for themselves. And then I'm going to do something else. So
Okay,
that's
so
about making time for traction.
I want to just recap that for people who are listening, and also for me to make sure I got it, because what you just said there was really quite
Yeah.
profound. That the driving goal that will eventually get things done is not the checking off of getting things done. It sounds like there's two things embedded in what you said. One is decide how much time I'm going to spend on something and schedule it somewhere. Um, and then
Right.
the second is, and this is interesting because I have heard that your brain, well, I'll get to that in a second. The second is, instead of measuring by the check marks, measure what you're measuring is your use of attention. Did I do the thing that was important to me for the amount of time that I said I would do it? And part of why that's really interesting to me, and I wish I could remember I was actually talking to someone who used to do psychological experiments, and he told me once, he said that the way reinforcement works in the brain is it is the process that you are engaged in that gets reinforced. So if you have a kid spell words 10,000, spell 10,000 words, the process that will get reinforced in the brain is whatever mental process they use to spell a word, which hopefully works, in which case they'll be a good speller. But people who are not good spellers, they don't get better um, just because they've done 10,000 words. They kind of like hit a level and so one of the things that for me is very transformative in what you just said is I'm not going to train my brain to finish things. I'm going to train my brain because that's the feedback measure. The feedback measure is, did I do this without distraction for the amount of time? Do I just start off with a half an hour at a time, or is this something where I can even work up to it by saying 5 minutes here, 5 minutes there,
Sure.
like however
5 minutes
long
is
I'm
probably,
capable?
I would start with at least 15 minutes, probably start with 15 minutes and
Okay.
doing that, just saying, hey, I'm just going to work on this for 15 minutes. That's it. And make yourself stop, by the way, after those 15 minutes, even if you're in the flow and you love it and it's great. No, no, make yourself stop. What you're doing is you're training yourself to have more agency over your attention, right? So that over time you can say, yeah, I can sustain 15 minutes, no problem. Let's try 20. Let's try 25. Let's try 30. And by doing that, what you're doing is you're building that muscle. You're building that agency that you have to work on whatever you say you're going to work on without distraction. And just as important is that you begin to have a feedback loop, like you said, for how long things take you. Part of the tyranny of the to-do list, part of why to-do lists are so bad for you, is that there's no feedback mechanism, right? This is what we call the planning fallacy, that on average, studies have found that people take 3 times longer to finish a task than they predict. 3 times longer. We're terrible at predicting how long things will take us to finish, which is why we, procrastinate and why things take us so much longer. And then we get in a big rush and then we, have an all-nighter because we don't know how long things take us. Why? Because if all you do is put that on a to-do list, there's no tracking mechanism to see how long it actually took you. Whereas when you use a time boxing technique, which is what I propose in Indistractable, when you have that time in your calendar, you have a feedback mechanism to say, okay, let me see. I need to write that blog post. Okay, well, to do that, I think it's going to take me 5 hours. All right, well, I'm going to put 1 hour in my day to work on it every day for the next 5 days. And then at the end of day 1, you can look at that hour and say, let me see. Okay, I've got 5 hours to work on this. I just did 20% of it. Am I 20% through this task? Do I need more time? Do I need less time? And you can change that time box for the day ahead. You never want to change the time box within the day, but you can absolutely change it for the next day or the next day after. And so you have this feedback mechanism to realize how long things actually take you. And that's revolutionary because you become not only better at focusing your attention and sustaining your attention, you become better at predicting how long things will take you.
From an actual logistical point of view, how do you do this tracking? And I'm sitting here thinking, I really want to do this. Um, and I actually construct my schedule. I use an online schedule. So I actually construct my schedule, by putting events in my calendar. And there's not really a place in the calendar where I can go to say, oh, look, this thing, I had blocked out half an hour and I got 20% of it done or whatever. Do you schedule? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah,
You're the
so you
expert. What do I
schedule
do?
those reviews. Yeah, so when you're starting out, I would do it probably every day, but as you get better at this, you can only do it you can do it, once a week. So for me, I have time in my calendar, 8 p.m. every Sunday, where I look at my calendar for the week that just passed and I revise my calendar for the week ahead. So after you do it for a while, things pretty much stay the same, right? I have my meetings pretty much at the same time. I have my writing time pretty much at the same time. I have time when I go to the gym, time when I'm with my family. That stuff tends to stay pretty consistent. But if, somebody needs to meet with me and I only have time at this time, then I'll move some things around. Or if I say, oh, I've got a big project I'm working on, maybe I'll give a little bit more time, a little bit less time. So you're making those adjustments in the way a scientist would run an experiment. So the idea behind time boxing and becoming indistractable is not to be a drill sergeant and make sure that you follow everything, that you put on the calendar, or else you're a bad person. The idea is to run experiments, is to be a scientist. What does a scientist do? A scientist comes up with a hypothesis, they run an experiment, and then they look at the results and they run another experiment so that they can learn more. And so that's what you're going to do with your calendar. You're going to make a hypothesis of this is how much time I think I need for the various areas of my life, right? Taking care of myself, taking care of others, taking care of my work, putting that time in your calendar, and then on a regular basis, reviewing it, maybe at the end of the day, maybe at the beginning of the day, maybe once a week, to make sure that you're making adjustments for your calendar in the week ahead so that it is easier to follow. So what many people find is they put that they want to do something at one part of the day, but for one reason or another, it doesn't feel right. It doesn't work out for them. So I encourage them to change that time. For example, for many years, I used to write first thing in the morning. And then I moved to Singapore and I need to start taking calls in the morning so I could be in communication with the States. Well, my life changed. So that means my schedule needs to change. So now I move that time slot a little later on. And now I've got my new revised schedule. So it's an iterative process. The most important thing is, though, when you make your schedule for the day, don't touch it, right? Don't touch it. Even if you go off track, that's okay. You want to make sure that you just do what the schedule tells you to do. Once you make that schedule, just do what it tells you to do, because you can't call something a distraction unless you know what it distracted you from. Okay, let me say that again. Write this down if you can, if you're listening. You cannot call something a distraction unless you know what it's distracting you from. The only way to know if you got distracted is to look at what is traction for that period of time. Anything that is not what you plan to do is a distraction. So even if what you plan to do is play video games, great. Nothing wrong with playing video games. Enjoy it. Anything else is a distraction if what you plan to do was that thing. So you've got to plan out that time. That's the only way to know whether you actually got distracted from something.
Wow. Okay. That my mind is somewhat reeling from this. How do you decide? Because also in the example you just gave, you hinted at some things that I hadn't been understanding already, which is you mentioned that it was family time and gym time. So it sounds like number one, you're not just doing this with your work hours. And number two, what is the level of granularity? So do you just say this is gym time, or do you say this is 20 minutes of cardio, 20 minutes of weight training? Do you say it's family time, or do you say this is time with my wife, this is time with my kids? How fine grained do you get?
Yeah. So big picture, what you want to do is to separate your life into what I call these 3 life domains. And so these are concentric circles starting with you. So when you look at your week ahead, the first thing I want you to do is to make time for yourself, right? So this is so important because if you can't take care of yourself, can't take care of other people, you can't make an impact on the world. You have to take care of yourself first. So our values, what are values? Values are defined as attributes of the person you want to become. So the purpose of a schedule is to turn your values into time. Turn your values into time by asking yourself, how would the person I want to become spend their time taking care of themselves? So what might fall under that category? Well, the person I want to become is the kind of person who reads books. Okay, do you have time to read in your schedule? The person I want to become is the kind of person who takes care of their physical health. Wonderful. Do you have time for a walk or meditation or the gym or whatever? Put that time in your schedule in whatever way is good for you. It's not up to me or anyone else to tell you how you should spend your time. It has to be spent according to your values. So whether that's 15 minutes of taking a walk or 2 hours of, marathon training, doesn't matter. It's what's important to you. Now, for me, in terms of nitty gritty, I don't plan things that are less than 15 minutes. Less than 15 minutes, I'll just bucket it in with something else. So for example, let's say I have a bunch of little admin tasks, right? Like taxes or, little paperwork type stuff. No problem. I'll put an hour block and I'll call it admin. And that's when I'll do all my little admin tasks. Sometimes I'll have big blocks of time, for example, with my family. So the next concentric circle after you is your relationships. So this is where we have to plan time for the people we love. Whether that's our family, our friends, we've got to make that time to invest in those relationships. So many times what I'll do is I'll plan big blocks of time with my family for what we call planned spontaneity. It sounds like an oxymoron, but hear me out. So when we plan time together, for example, on weekends, if I'm going to spend time with my daughter, sometimes we have a 3-hour block of time when we're going to be together, and I don't know what we're going to do with that time. Maybe we'll go to the park. Maybe we'll go to the science museum. I don't know what we're going to do with that time. It doesn't really matter. The reason it's so important to block at that time is so that I know what I will not be doing with that time. I will not be checking social media. I will not be looking at work emails. That's not what I'm going to do because that time is blocked to be with someone I love very much. So after you have that time for relationships, the next life domain is your work. So this is where you've got to make time for 2 kinds of work. Work can be bifurcated into reactive work and reflective work. Reactive work is the kind of work that we do reacting to things, right? Reacting to emails, reacting to notifications, reacting to messages and meetings. That's reactive work. That's how most people spend their entire day, bouncing around, being told what to do because of all this reactive work, which many of our jobs require us to be available, which is totally fine. Schedule that time. What you also want to schedule, and this is something that everybody should do, is time for reflective work. Reflective work is where the strategizing, the planning, the thinking, for God's sakes, the kind of work that can only be done without distraction. You have got to plan that time in your day. Even if it's 30, 45 minutes, you've got to put that time in your schedule, or you'll find yourself running real fast in the wrong direction. So low performers, all they do is reactive work. High performers make at least some time in their day for this reflective work time.
Boy, as you're saying this, I'm thinking about my own patterns. I'm like, yeah, the reactive stuff is really easy for me, right? Because I don't have to stop and think about what I'm doing. I just, oh, look, there's a message. I was
Right.
telling you before we started, I went to a networking event a couple of weeks ago, and I gave people my scheduling link and just said, if you want to follow up, if you want to connect, schedule something. And I've gotten, I think, close to 40 some odd hours worth of my time over last week, this week, and next week have been scheduled by other people. And what I am discovering is, the nice thing is I don't have to think about what I'm scheduling for the day. The not so nice thing is is that I had a bunch of reflective work I had been planning on doing. It has
Yeah.
very much gotten lost. Um,
Yeah.
so,
And other people are planning your schedule for you, which is true of everything, right? So if you don't plan your day, somebody will plan it for you, whether it's what's going on in the news or what your boss wants from you, what your kids want from you. Somebody's going to eat up that time if you don't decide in advance how you want to spend it.
wow. So how often do you sit down and map out? I mean, you were talking before about keeping today a constant, but then mapping tomorrow differently. And you also, at another point, mentioned doing something once a week or once a month. What is the
Right.
rhythm of this? How do you do this rhythmically?
Once a week.
Once a
Don't do
week.
it for
Okay.
more than once a week. I'm not a big fan of life visioning and vision boards and planning regrets of the dying. Right, these type of goals are so far out that people tend to get so infatuated by these long term things as opposed to asking themselves, wait a minute, what do I want to do next week? Right, like how do I live out my values tomorrow? How do I make the person I want to become clear in my schedule? So that's where we have to start. So I say plan out within a week's time, not more than that. That's really the now some people, if your schedule changes a lot from day to day, right? If you have the kind of job where you just don't know what's going to happen at the end of the week, some people work those kind of jobs. Everybody has some kind of visibility into at least the next day. So some
Yeah.
people, that I've worked with, last thing before they close up shop for the day is they plan out the next day. They time box the next day. Now you don't start from scratch every day, right? Because hey, I want to spend 3 hours exercising this week. I want to spend 4 hours with my family, whatever the case might be. So you're working in this like Tetris puzzle where you're putting in that time in your schedule so that when the next day comes, you've got that already filled with certain necessities. A bedtime. Do you have a
Right.
bedtime? Super important. We all know how important sleep is. We've heard this ad nauseum about we got to get enough sleep. We tell our kids they have to have a bedtime, but do we have a bedtime?
Oh, I have a
Right?
bedtime. I just
Got to
never
have
go to
that in your
sleep then.
schedule. So, okay, there you go.
Right.
So that would be a distraction. If you say in your schedule, I'm going to go to bed at a certain time. If you didn't get to bed on time, there's only one of three reasons. It's either an external trigger, an internal trigger, or a planning problem. Every distraction has only as a cause
I
one of those three things. And so
I
once
know
you
exactly.
understand what is the source,
So
you
tell
can do
me tell
something
me
about
if
it.
this is an internal thing or if this is a planning problem. So the issue is, so 10 to 30 is my bedtime because I get up at 6:30 to write. And 6:30 is my writing time. Uh, my bedtime is 10:30. 10:30 comes around, I start to get tired, and I see the book that I'm reading on the ottoman. And right now we're talking about a fiction book. It's always a fiction. This is my escapist me time. And I go, okay, I'm just going to read one chapter before I fall asleep. And generally, I'll read for an hour. at which point I've passed the low and now I'm kind of in a high excitation state again, and I will in fact get to sleep between 11:30 and 12:30. But then I get up at 6:30, and by the end of the week, I'm now 5 or 6 hours worth of sleep deprived. So then I sleep in late on Saturdays, and I do this virtually every week, and I beat myself up about it. Is this because I'm responding to an internal trigger, or is this that there's a planning problem? I mean, clearly there's an internal trigger happening here somewhere, but
Yeah, it sounds to me like it's an internal trigger. And there's a phenomenon called revenge procrastination. Have you heard about revenge procrastination?
no, I haven't.
It's an interesting phenomenon. The idea is, and this is very common, right? With you do it with a book. A lot of people do it with their phone. They're so exhausted, they just want to go to sleep. And what's the last thing they do while they're in bed? They're scrolling away on their phone when they're so tired. Why don't you just go to sleep if you're tired? The theory is that we're doing this because of an internal trigger, that when we feel like something is missing emotionally in our life, when we feel like we don't have enough control and agency over our day, we take revenge on ourselves at night. Why? Because this is the one thing I control. If my life feels crazy during the day, at least this I am in control of. It's something that gives me a sense of agency. So that's where we need to really look at these internal triggers and ask ourselves, what are we escaping? Right? Not that there's, we don't need to pathologize this. This isn't something we need to moralize or medicalize. It's just about having those tools ready to say, wait a minute, okay, I said I was going to go to bed at 10:30. It's 10:30 right now. What's going on? Right? What am I experiencing? What's this feeling? And how can I deal with it in a healthy way that leads me towards traction than distraction?
So I'll tell you, I think this actually, for me, wraps into a planning issue because I know exactly what thought goes through my head. As soon as you said that, I'm like, I know exactly what it is. What I always think is, I haven't done anything for myself yet today. And gosh darn it, my hour of reading is the one thing that I do consistently for myself. That is just,
There you go. There you go. Which is fine. There's nothing wrong with reading fiction. It's great. It's wonderful. What I would recommend for you though is to plan that time in your day. Don't make it something that comes at the expense of something else that's important to you. If sleep is important to you and your bedtime is 10:30, well then plan the reading time at 9:30 or whatever it is throughout the day. So what I'm forcing you to do is to make trade-offs, right? That a to-do list doesn't force any trade-offs. You can always add more to a to-do list. When you force yourself to look at your values and then look at your calendar, there is a constraint of the same 24 hours in a day. So something has to come at the price of something else, which is good. That's reality, right? Because you can't make more time. You have to work with the constraint of a time box calendar.
my brain doesn't believe that though. My brain believes that as long as I say I want to do 29 hours worth of work, I can do it in 24 hours. I just have to work really fast.
If you figure out how to get those extra hours, please let me know. I want a ticket to this time machine that you found.
Will do. So thank you very, very much for joining me. How can people find you? And tell us, about where can they find you, the book, you know, how can they
Sure.
send you tons of
So
money and worship you and all those good things?
I appreciate it. All you need to do is check out my blog at nearandfar.com. It's spelled NIR, like my first name, so NIRandfar.com. And my latest book is called Indistractable, How to Control Your Attention and Choose Your Life. And if you go to indistractable.com, there's a workbook there that's totally complimentary that anybody can get. It's at Indistractable, that's spelled IN, the word distract, ABLE. So indistractable.com is where that free workbook can be found.
Thank you so much for joining us. And it's been a pleasure.
My pleasure. Thank you.